Thank you.
Very good. And your microphone makes all the difference.
Excellent.
Alhamdulillah. Yes.
That's due to your kindness and generosity.
Alhamdulillah. He allows that. He
Thank you.
permits it.
Thank
He
you.
provides for it. So let us get started then. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. May it please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to join us again this hour as I, Dr. Omar Zaid from uh, the bright and bluegrass state of Kentucky, uh, have another meeting with Brother Abdul Karim from Kuala Lumpur, originally from Canada and originally from someplace else. But anyway, we're all originally from someplace else, if I understand the scriptures correctly. Dear brother, thank you once again for joining us. Assalamu alaikum. Um,
Walaikum, walaikum salam. My pleasure.
um, you're welcome. Um, I would like to continue to explore um, sort of in an unscripted fashion, just have an ongoing conversation, exploring, what it is that Islam is supposed to be and what it is that Islam has been misrepresented as, and how this has come to happen. You've mentioned in the past that our Muslim forefathers, if you want to put it that way, have taken certain passages from their traditions and either inserted them or superimposed them on Al Quran or as misinterpretations or perhaps even uh, overwritten what we might consider to be spiritual, um, authentically dictated scripture via Jibril to our beloved Prophet, and they've used their own traditions to override this diktat, if you will, that we call the Quran, Al Quran. Now, this is a serious accusation, but it's not without precedent in other religions. You will see, I know from my own studies, for example, that the Hindu priests who were very jealous of Buddha after his death, they did something similar to whatever has come down to us as his uh, teachings. Not that we know what they really were, because none of them were written down for 500 years afterwards. And by then, they were. Um, they went through a syncretic process with the Hindu traditions, and the very things that Buddha apparently hated were incorporated in that religion. What has come down to us as Buddhism to this day is not necessarily in its purest form, that's for sure. Now, I know from my own studies again, as I looked at the Old Testament and especially the New Testament, that there were traditions of men that were translated or superimposed or interposed on what came to us or what came to Judeo Christians as the gospel. I'll give you two examples. One came from the Roman religion, which deified the Roman emperors, for example. We know that Virgil wrote a poem that said something like this: "Unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given." Well, that's word for word in the New Testament, you see. And this was written by Virgil as a poem with respect to Augustus Caesar. And he was called the Son of God, and Julius was called his father, the Father God. And they had temples and even human sacrifice to that effect for quite some time afterwards. There's another incident of a Jewish priest from the Levitical school His name was Philo of Alexandria, Philo Alexander of Alexandria, who wrote about 50 years before Christ um, as something to this effect. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh. This is this is word for word, almost verbatim, you see, in the New Testament. I think it's the Epistle of John or the Gospel of John. So these things are what you accuse some of the traditionalists of doing early on in the history of Islamic literature and the Hadith and whatnot. Is not without precedent in other religions. This has happened. And it's happened for socio-political reasons. Okay, so it's propaganda, is what it is, and it gets a theocentric, persuasive platform. Okay, God says, therefore it must be, and therefore you must obey. And this is almost like, okay, well, the Sultan is there because God has put him there. And well, this is divine right of the kings in the West and authorized through the papacy, who's given the keys of St. Peter and says, okay, he's the divine ruler. You got to obey him no matter what he says. Okay, no matter how unethical or immoral it appears to be, he's right. Okay, and you're obviously wrong because you're just a peon. You're just a rug kisser. Okay, a shoe kisser, a ring kisser. You get the idea here, brother. I'm being pretty blunt, but not as blunt as I could be.
Yeah, there's no need for that. I know what you're getting at.
Yes. So
I lived in Canada for 20 years. I know the Canadian American kind of slang or vernacular.
yes, yes, that's why I share it with you so freely. So my question to you today, dear brother, inshallah, can you give us some examples or some similar examples of how it is that these traditions of men, one coming from a poet, another, and that one about Julius Caesar was also not just from Virgil, it was from the Sibylline Scrolls, you see. And these were virgins who attended, the Vestal virgins who attended the temples, you see. So, this is great from the great smoke, the great white smoke, that comes up from wherever it is these divine diktats come from, or so-called divine diktats come from. I'm sure there must be examples in the Muslim literature, whether they be scriptural, parascriptural, or traditional, or whatever the case might be, where men have assigned their will to God's will and overridden God's will, overridden God's diktats, according to the scripture and even according to the beloved prophet's intention, if you will. So I'm wondering, between the time that the prophet died and let's say, well, let's maybe expand it a little bit to the time of Salahuddin. We've already covered that area, and I'd like to review it, if you will, because what's happened is that this has been done, and the war against reason was won by the people who did this, you see, and we know that this is established fact now. It may be not established for many of our listeners, but between you and I, as academics looking back upon this history, it's established fact. Okay, so and you have looked at it from one perspective, I've looked at it from another's perspective, and we come together in some form of agreement here and say, oh yeah, we don't know all the data, but it appears to be that this is exactly what happened, and this is not the first time it's happened to any of the prophets and their work and whatever it is that they left behind. This has happened before, you see, where all these dungeons and dragons and demons and jinn and all this other stuff comes in to muddy the waters, okay, so that people are then subjected to the muddy waters rather than the clear sayings of this, that, or the next prophet, you see. So, between the time of our prophet's death and Salahuddin, this process seemed to have become somewhat concrete, even though it was filled with fitna. But there was a tradition that was established, and we'll talk about how much more it concrete, became concrete afterwards, perhaps next week and the weeks to come, inshallah. But for the moment now, just as I gave you a couple of very clear examples, there are many more. Okay, but a couple of clear examples of what has come down to us as the Bible, and is clearly not dictated by any angel to any man, you see, but has been prepared and presented to the Christian world, at least, as the Word of God. Uh, I'm sure this has happened in Islam. So, with that having been said, can you give us some examples, dear brother, inshallah?
Yes, certainly. I'll see what I can do. First of all, thank you once again for having me on for this very interesting discussion and for the opportunity to share thoughts with you and your viewers. Before I begin, let me just do my quick.
Of course.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, dealing with these questions, of course, these are big questions, and I suppose it is wise to choose our words carefully. I myself have been, how can I say, puzzled. At first, I was sort of like bewildered. I have to say, I may have referred to this experience in one of our previous videos, where while I was writing a paper on abrogation,
Hmm.
or was it jihad, one of the two areas that I have been quite heavily involved. One is jihad, and the other one is the doctrine of abrogation. I sensed that there was something I was missing. That was not long after I left the institute, the International Institute of Advanced Islamic Studies, and I began to think a little more freely. That was after December 2017, and
Hmm.
I was writing this paper, completing this paper on jihad, I believe, and I could sense that there was something that was escaping me. I could sense there was a problem that lay at the core of the problems of the Ummah. And
Hmm.
I was trying to put my finger on it. What exactly is the heart of the matter? Where the, I felt for sure that there was a wrong turn taken by
Hmm.
the ulama and by the ummah as well, and
Hmm.
maybe more than just one wrong turn. And
Hmm.
I really wanted to find out what exactly was it, because while I was in the official Islamic sector, 5 years at the Islamic Science University of Malaysia here in Malaysia, and then 10 years at the International Institute of Advanced Islamic Studies, also in Malaysia as a research fellow. So over the course of 15 years in the Islamic institutions, these questions were never in the foreground and rarely raised, as you yourself noted, by the academic people that work in Islamic institutions. There are almost certain no go areas, and
Hmm.
we are not encouraged to make certain inquiries on certain subjects or certain
Hmm.
topics. For example, why did the Sahaba break into a civil war after the passing of the Prophet? Why
Hmm.
did 15,000 Sahaba died in the first fitna alone, the battles of
Hmm.
Camel and the
Hmm.
Battle of Siffin? This is just one question, one of the questions that we are not encouraged, to follow up on. And I find it problematic because, as you know, before coming to Islam, I was a student of philosophy. Philosophy means the love of wisdom. I don't see
Yes.
anything un-Islamic about it. Sophia means wisdom. Sorry, philos means love, and Sophia means wisdom. So,
Hmm.
but yet, in Muslim ulama seem to have a very bad feeling about philosophy and rationality
Hmm.
more generally.
Mm.
And so they look upon thinking as something that is a pious person should not do too much of, or perhaps don't do any thinking about, in matters of religion. And even Taha Rawani observed in one of his writings that among the Muslim population there seems to be a kind of what he called, I'm quoting almost verbatim here, a general contempt for reason and reasoning, end of
Mm-hmm.
quote. So I think this is very problematic because my reading of the Quran tells me that there's a strong emphasis that Allah Ta'ala places on reason, the akal, on using our mind to the point where there are two verses that condemn people who don't use their minds or brains. One in verse 22 in Surah number 8 says basically that the people who don't use their reason are the worst of creatures, not
Mm-hmm.
just bad, the worst. And
Mm-hmm.
then in Surah number 10, verse number 100, he says that he will place ridges or filth or confusion on the people that do not use their reason.
Mm-hmm.
And how many times do we hear elsewhere in the Quran, Allah is asking us, will you not reason? Afala takilun? Afala
Mm-hmm.
tadabbarun? Will you not ponder? And, afala tatafakkarun? So, will you not meditate? And so I'm really puzzled that despite the strong emphasis on rationality and the use of reason, which to me, you pretty much have to use your mind. Otherwise, how can you possibly understand anything? And that includes the Quran.
Mm-hmm.
So, despite a strong emphasis on the use of the mind and reason, why do the traditional ulama belittle reason so much and tell us things like, don't use your own opinion, don't use your logic, it will mislead you. And they have even come up with perhaps fabricated two hadiths to the effect in which the Prophet allegedly said that whoever expresses his opinion about the Quran has booked for himself a place in hell and he did something wrong, even if his opinion is correct. And
Oof.
as another scholar from yeah, I know
Mm.
this is unbelievable. You can
Yes.
find these two hadiths in a book by Abdullah Sa'id. A PDF
Mm-hmm.
version of it is available free online.
Mm-hmm.
The book is called Quran, an Introduction, and all you
Mm-hmm.
need to do is open the PDF format and just do a search for the words place in hell. Perhaps those three words will bring you to
Mm-hmm.
that hadith immediately on the right page. So,
Mm-hmm.
and also other people have confirmed this. It is accepted even by the most traditional Sunni ulama that there was such an event as the closure of the gates to ijtihad, the closing of the mind, so to speak. Independent juristic thinking was no longer allowed after
Mm-hmm.
that period. That was around the turn of the millennium. The gates to Ijtihad were shut, and now a new methodology was to be adopted by all ulama, and that methodology is called taqlid, which means the unquestioning following of tradition or the
Mm-hmm.
unquestioning following of the works of the previous scholars. As
Mm-hmm.
one scholar from the Middle East put it, his name is Sultan Butti, Sultan Ali al-Muhairi. He has a
Mm-hmm.
couple of papers on the Sharia in the United Arab Emirates online, once again, the modern and pre-modern period. He basically states there that with the rise of taqlid and the shutting of the gates to ijtihad, the so-called first two sources of the Sharia, the Quran and Sunnah, became remote, is what he calls them. And the works of the ulama actually, in effect, in practice, became the primary sources. So you see, we see here a displacement of not only the words of Allah in the Quran, but even the supposedly alleged words of the Prophet. Both are sidelined, so to speak, and we are expected to turn to and follow the authorities in the form of the ulama who did the work to reinterpret these works for us. So there's no need for anyone else to refer to the original primary source of the Quran, principally, of course, of Islam, principally, of course, the Quran. So
Mm-hmm.
this was what I call, and to go back to my experience when I was writing that paper, trying to figure out what went wrong. I think I mentioned that after 3 days of racking my brains, suddenly this one word only popped into my brain. That suddenly the whole landscape became, as it were, clear, and the one word was eclipse. And I immediately
Mm-hmm.
thought of, as I mentioned before, I think Allah Ta'ala finally took pity on me and popped this word in my brain. And I
Mm-hmm.
realized that what went wrong was that the light of the revelation was eclipsed by something, and the
Mm-hmm.
something was none other than tradition.
Mm-hmm.
So now we are still getting some light from the Quran, but less than what we would be if it was not being blocked by the
Mm-hmm.
traditions. And I would also include the work of some of the ulama, not all the ulama. Some ulama have worthy works
Mm-hmm.
for example, Muhammad Ghazali's thematic commentary on the Quran, I think is excellent. I could not find a single word or line in it that I could not agree with, and there are other worthy scholars. But there are other scholars, for example, like Ibn Kathir, who promote the idea that the Quran abrogated the previous revelations of the Injil and the Torah, which I think is a gross error on his part, and unfortunately, many
Mm-hmm.
of our contemporaries have, adopted it. In fact, I just spoke earlier today with Brother Ahmad Farouk Musa. I don't know if you know him. He is the chairman of the Islamic Renaissance Front, which was opened years
Mm-hmm.
ago for him by Tariq Ramadan. And then he recently also invited Mustafa Akil to give a talk. Mustafa Akil was arrested as he was trying to leave and go back to Turkey by the religious department. That was resolved through some back channel, intervention by the former minister of Turkey, president of Turkey, who contacted,
Mm-hmm.
I think, one of the royal families in Malaysia, who then requested basically that Mustafa Akil be released, and so he was released. The reason he
Mm-hmm.
was arrested was because he gave a talk without a permit from the religious affairs department.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, in that talk, he also mentioned in our discussion with Brother Farouk, he mentioned that they in his institute translated the Muhammad Assad's English translation of the Quran into the Malay language, but
Mm-hmm.
the religious department refused to give its approval of it, and so he's not in a position to publish it at this time. I think he's going through some appeal process, but
Mm-hmm.
they found about 49 objectionable things in his
Mm-hmm.
translation, and at the top was none other than his than the message in Musa Muhammad Assad's translation of the Quran about abrogation. You see,
Mm-hmm.
Muhammad Assad rejects the doctrine of abrogation, but the
Mm-hmm.
local religious ulama accept it. In fact,
Mm-hmm.
I recall even our deputy chairman, Dr. Osman Bakar, one time saying at the institute at a meeting that we had that Utusan, which is a newspaper in Malaysia, one of the major
Yes.
newspapers,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
accused him of not believing in the doctrine of abrogation. So
Mm-hmm.
when I heard that, of course, I was surprised. But anyway, the belief in the doctrine of abrogation, of course, is part of traditional Islam, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't find any support for it in the Quran. And as Muhammad Asad points out, there is not even a single tradition in the entire corpus of the Hadith, all six books of them, that supports or gives credence to the doctrine of abrogation. In other words, the Prophet is nowhere on record of saying that there is such a thing as abrogation in Islam. And
Mm-hmm.
abrogation, of course, takes at least three major forms. One is the abrogation by the Quran of the former revelation. Another one is the abrogation of the Quran by the Quran. And finally, we have the abrogation of the Quran by the Hadith. But actually, there's a fourth one, which is the abrogation of the Quran by the ulama, because we
Mm-hmm.
do have in traditional Islam ulama who claimed, like Abu Hassan al-Karhi, who was a Hanafite scholar, who claimed that if anything, I'm quoting, but pretty close to the original, if anything we say contradicts the Quran, please consider the Quran to be abrogated. In other words, consider our position to be the correct one. So I thought
Mm-hmm.
this is referred to by both Tajabir al-Wani in his book Reviving the Balance between
Mm-hmm.
Quran and Sunnah, and also by Muhammad Shahrur in his book Quran, Morality and Critical Reason. So this is in the literature.
Mm-hmm.
This is a known fact. Even Sunni scholars acknowledge that this happened.
Mm-hmm.
So now to come back to the main issue, I think the problem of where did the problem really begin? I was Once I had that insight, as you remember, I began to go in both direction, both forward,
Yeah.
looking at the implication of the eclipse, and also backward, so to speak, looking at the causes of the eclipse.
Hmm.
And so initially, I came up with, say, four stages, and I have a video on it. I think we have one with you as well on it. The
Yes, yes.
four, right?
I've
So
just referred that video to my students for their review. It's not the day I didn't before, but I think it's fundamental to any revisionist position that
yeah.
your work, your lecture there on these four principles needs to be understood clearly.
Yeah, so these were for the analysis sort of condensed into four stages. But of course, if you do an extended analysis, you can do a sort of medium extended analysis. Then you come up with six stages, and I have a video on that too, and a book, in fact. But then, if you do the full analysis, you will
Hmm.
find that each of the four stages can be broken down into three sub stages. So if you take
Sure.
three and multiply by four, you get a total of 12. But anyway, very briefly, it started with the belittling of reason, the
Hmm.
putting reason to sleep, so to speak, and elevating hadith above reason, tradition above, reason. In other words, elevating nakal above akal. So when that happened, of course, there was exegetes began to misunderstand the revelation, the Quran, and why was rationality belittled? Well, that happened in the context of the struggles or clashes between the rationalists and the traditionalists over the best or the better way to understand the Quran. The
Hmm.
rationalists said, well, quite rationally, I would say that the best way to understand anything, including the Quran, is to use your brain. That's why Allah has given us a brain to use it. But the traditionalists somehow had a problem with that. No, that is not the best way. The better way to understand and follow the Quran is to take the opinions of our predecessors as authoritative of the scholars, and then follow them, you see, and follow the tradition. In other words, they said we need to see the revelation through the eyes of tradition, through the lens of tradition, and that will give us the better understanding of the revelation, because after all, the people before us, they were closer to the prophet, therefore they understood the Quran better. So who are
Hmm.
we to compete with these enlightened individuals, and so on and so forth, the argument. Of
Hmm.
course, the problem with that argument is that not everybody who was close to the prophet actually believed him or believed in the Quran and became a Muslim. So physical proximity to the Prophet is no guarantee that one will understand the Quran, let alone become a Muslim. So there are flaws
Hmm.
in this argument. But that it was part of a political struggle, as you know, which also had a political manifestation in
Hmm.
the 8th century in 786, when Musa al-Hadi put 5,000 people to death for the crime, believe it or not, of using their brain, for the
Yes.
crime of thinking. They were accused of being thinkers, and not just any kind of thinkers. They were accused of being free thinkers. So they had two strikes against them.
Hmm.
They believed in reason and they believed in freedom, and that was a no-no according to the traditionalists. So
Hmm.
this was a major blow against rationality and rationalism, and things went continue to go downhill afterwards, because I think that once you shut down your mind, your brain, a person will accept almost anything irrational. For example, such as the assertion that a narration called hadith is a revelation, that or
Hmm.
and that it is even equal to the word of God, that it is
Hmm.
from God, because this is what the ulama did. They declared the hadith to be wahi, the second
Hmm.
revelation, the second inspiration, and that's how they developed the concept of divine ayn, the concept of dual revelation. So now we have two revelations according to them. We have the book of Allah, the Quran, and then we have if you include all the books of hadith, you can include 100 more books of hadith, because the total number is around 100. 60 books of hadith in a Sunni tradition and 40 books of hadith in the Shia tradition. So the
Hmm.
ulama are now expecting us to believe it. Let's take the Sunni ulama for the time being, that Allah Ta'ala sent, six, or according to some, up to 60 more books of revelation to
Hmm.
clarify the first book of Revelation, which is the Quran, which is, I think, quite absurd and
Mm-hmm.
less than rational, if you ask me. But that was the second stage, so to speak. First, the
Mm-hmm.
repression of reason, its subordination to tradition, then the elevation of tradition to the rank of revelation. So, what we are seeing here is a gradual rise of tradition. First, tradition overtakes reason. Now it is has caught up with revelation. The third stage is when tradition continues its meteoric rise and now rises even above revelation, and it does it in three different ways. One, tradition of the hadith or the sunnah. To al-Shafi, sunnah and hadith meant the same thing. So now the sunnah or the hadith begins to judge the word of Allah. So the ulama have set up a furqan or a criterion above the criterion of Allah to judge the Allah's words. So now my question is, where do they get the audacity to say that the words of ordinary human beings are in a position or have any kind of authority to judge the words of Allah? Isn't Allah the judge? Aren't they putting the cart in front of the horse? Aren't they
Mm-hmm.
turning the whole deen upside down? I think they are. And they didn't stop there. That wasn't enough to say that the Sunnah explains the Quran as if Allah Ta'ala did not express himself clearly, which is a kind of blasphemous statement because it
Mm-hmm.
attributes a personal trait to Allah. Allah is perfect. He doesn't have any weaknesses and flaws, and neither does his book. So when they start saying things like there are some words in the Quran which are not intelligible or require clarification or explanation, they are basically denying what the Quran says about itself, that it is a clear book, has a kitabul mubin, about which there is no doubt. They seem to be bent on creating doubt about it by their allegations that the Quran is lacks clarity, that it is also is incomplete. That was the second accusation they made because it does not include details on how to pray. So are they suggesting that Allah Ta'ala was forgetful and he forgot to include the details on how to do the physical prostrations in the Quran? Is that what they are suggesting? So they are now attributing a second personal trait to Allah, which is forgetfulness. I mean, this is clearly blasphemous. How dare they make these kind of claims about the Quran, and by implication, they are suggesting somehow that, Allah Taala somehow now needs assistance from his own creatures to make himself clear, and also to make the book to fill in what he did, to fill in the blanks, so to speak, in the book, so to
Mm-hmm.
speak. Can you believe this? And a third preposterous claim that they have made. This is all traditional Sunni Islam, by the way. And this is the majority view. The third claim is that there are a number of verses in the Quran that contradict each other. So now they are making a third claim about Allah Ta'ala, that he was not coherent when he revealed the Quran, that he is, that this is the third human attribute they are ascribing to him, that of being incoherent or being blurred. Let's use this word. So where do they get the audacity to make such claims? I believe that the lack of clarity is not in the book. Rather, it is in the brains of the people who do not use their brains to
Yes,
understand the
of
Quran.
course.
This is to be expected. If you don't use your brain, of course you will not understand words and
Mm-hmm.
verses. And of course you will get notions about the book that are alien to it. So these traditional Mufassirun have contradicted Allah Ta'ala in three ways in the Quran when they claim that, contrary to what the Quran claims, the Quran is not a clear book. The Quran is not complete. They are claiming
Mm-hmm.
this too, and that it is less than coherent. The Quran says that it is clear, complete, and coherent. Haza Kitabul Mubin, and the book is easy to understand and remember. Surah Al Qamar, verses 17, 22, and two other verses. Four times this is repeated. The Quran covers everything. We have explained everything in detail. Kulli Shai is the Arabic word. And finally, we are assured by Allah Ta'ala that we will not find any contradictions in the Quran. So Allah is also
Mm-hmm.
assuring us that there are no contradictions in the Quran. But no, so that was the third major error of traditional exegesis,
Mm-hmm.
to subordinate the word of Allah to the words of men. That was already a second major mistake.
Mm-hmm.
The By the way, mistake number two and number three all also have elements of shirk in them, because the moment you give a partner to the book of Allah,
Mm-hmm.
I would like to know, is it possible to give a partner or partners, so to speak, 100 partners to the book of Allah without also giving a partner to Allah himself? That's a question for these people. And secondly, can you elevate the human beings' words above the words of Allah without also falling into or lapsing into shirk? Because now you're saying there's an authority higher than Allah, and it is the people whose words are now being used to judge, explain, complete, and rationalize the revelation of Allah. So this was the third major disaster. Of course, part of this, you know, abrogation, I also should mention that the contradictions, the alleged contradictions in the Quran are resolved according to the ulama by recourse, not so much to the hadith, which is used to resolve the two alleged, issues, lack of clarity and incompleteness. This time they turn to the doctrine of abrogation and they say that if two verses appear to contradict each other, the verse revealed later will take precedence over the verse revealed earlier. Now, there's a difference of opinion among the scholars here. Shah
Mm-hmm.
Waliullah found only 5 cases of abrogation, but some ulama have found as many as 500 alleged cases of abrogation. But most modern opinion is against the doctrine of abrogation. Many people have rejected it, beginning with Abu Muslim al-Isfahani, who rejected the doctrine of abrogation of the Quran by the Quran on the basis of the 3 verses in the Quran where Allah says that we will never find a change in the words of Allah. So the
Mm-hmm.
moment you say abrogation, you are saying that Allah is changing his mind and that he's changing his words. Now, that is absurd. That is, again, attribution of a human personal quality to Allah, and that is actually forbidden by many ulama themselves. Allah is not like a human being. We should not attribute to him this kind of flaws and attribute flaws and try to
Mm-hmm.
find faults with the Quran. But this is how they justified, the traditional ulama justified, bringing in first the
Mm-hmm.
hadith to allegedly to explain and complete the Quran, and secondly, the doctrine of abrogation to take care of the alleged contradiction or contradictions in the Quran. So that was the third disaster. The final disaster was, I would say, the replacement basically of a religion of the Deen of peace, Islam as a way of peace, by Islam as an ideology of war. And that was the final error, and with it
Mm-hmm.
we have the doctrine of Jihad al-Talab. Some people call it preemptive war, but I think that's something of a euphemism. It's more like a war of aggression because Jihad al-Talab, let's remind ourselves, requires the Muslim community. And by the way, the ulama have elevated Jihad al-Talab into a sixth pillar of Islam. In other words, it is something required, like prayer and fasting and what have you.
Yes.
So with the introduction of the doctrine of war of aggression, Jihad al-Talab, which, by the way, was achieved by abrogating all the verses that teach peace by the verses that teach war. You see, this is how they did it,
Mm-hmm.
and they actually blame it on Allah. They claim that Allah Himself has abrogated
Mm-hmm.
120 or more of His own verses, and now He's asking us to follow 2 verses which sort of talk about fighting more strongly than other verses. That's verse number
Mm-hmm.
5 in Surah Tawbah, Surah number 9, and verse 29 in the same Surah. So the ulama have, in the last of their 4 major mistakes was to transform the religion of peace into a religion of war or aggression. So now this has gotten the Muslim community into trouble because even some of the hadiths, like according to which the Prophet allegedly said that I was ordered to fight Nas people until they all say La ilaha illallah, there's no God but Allah. And then in the hadith goes on to say, but the people who are Muslims or who say La ilaha illallah, their blood and property are not halal for me, meaning that the blood and property of people who are kafirs are halal for people, for the
Yes.
Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
This is a gross falsification of the teaching of the Quran. Allah gave no such permission to anyone in the
Mm-hmm.
Quran. But it was on the basis of that hadith and the warlike interpretation of Islam that the leaders of a part of the Abbasid Empire, Khawarizm Shah and his deputy Inalchuk, they slaughtered 500 Mongol traders and subsequently 3 Mongol ambassadors, including 1 Muslim. And they stole the property of these people, sold it in the market, and then they sent the head of the Muslim, I think, in a box back to Genghis Khan. So this
Yes.
brutal
That was
act
that
was,
was his favorite nephew, by the way. That had.
oh, really?
That,
Oh,
yes, that was the
really?
Genghis Khan's favorite nephew,
Oh,
and
there you
that
go.
was the third caravan that had been treated in such a fashion. Genghis showed extensive patience here. He kept
Yeah.
on saying when his envoys returned with these terrible stories, he said, well, they must have misunderstood. They must have misunderstood my intentions. But when he saw his nephew's head, that was it. He stood up and went to war
Yeah.
as the
And
hammer of God.
exactly. So you know
Hmm.
what happened afterwards. So the Muslims
Yes,
brought this disaster on their own, on themselves through their incredibly ignorant, arrogant, and un-Islamic behavior.
yes,
It reminds me of the how the World War One broke out. There was an assassination of Archduke of Sarajevo and his wife by a Serbian nationalist. Two
yes.
people died in this political provocation once again.
Mm.
And how many people died in the war that followed? 20
Oh,
million casualties.
Jesus.
So 10 million for each person. And more than a million Muslims were slaughtered in reprisals by the forces, the Mongol forces against the Abbasids, who completely wiped off the Abbasid Empire off the face of the earth. So, what
Yes,
was the mistake of the Abbasids? They followed the Hadith instead of the Book of Allah. That was their
yes.
downfall, and they didn't use their reason. You see, because
Hmm.
reason tells you to consider the consequences of actions. I
Yes,
have to. That makes me responsible if I
yes,
and restrains me. The original meaning of the word atal is something that restrains. Usually
yes.
used to be used to describe the rope that
Hmm.
restrained
Hmm.
horses and camels. So
Yes,
they abandoned reason, they abandoned revelation, they followed the hadith, and it brought them destruction and a complete obliteration of that particular civilization. And looking at the modern context, do you see that, how many people died in Afghanistan in the bombings? About a million, the estimates say. How many more people died in the bombings of Iraq? Another million. Saddam Hussein attacked two countries. He went or waged a war of aggression, first Kuwait and then Iran. And what happened as a result? There was a
so,
blowback, just like there was a blowback against the Abbasids from the Mongols,
hmm,
and a
yes.
million people died in a bombing. So, million under from the when the Abbasid empire was destroyed, another million in Afghanistan, another million in Iraq. Now, do we see a pattern here or not? Please help
Of
me out if
course,
I'm missing anything.
of course, this is a pattern, and it's ungodly, and it reflects what some people call karma, and what I call spiritual law, what other people call natural law. So, and some of these laws, they don't really need to be written down. They're part of fitra, you see. And fitra cannot be overshadowed except by force, and there's no force in religion. So, what we're talking here about the Islamic repercussion or the un Islamic repercussions of the imposition of traditionalism on Muslims is no different than the church triumphant, according to the Catholic dogma. It's also the church militant. You see, you can't have a triumphant church without militancy. So this is the imperial spirit, and it's demonic to the hilt. It's satanic to the hilt because it smacks of selfishness. If I can legislate that you don't agree with my religion, that means that your possessions and your people under your rule become mine. That's imperialism. That's Romanism. It's no different. So the people who instilled these ideas and legislated them into the position of imperial law have done the same thing with this traditionalist position that you're just describing for us, brother. It's no different. Historically, it's no different. And the end results are the same. These empires all fall under the weight of their own sin, you see. So um, I am. I am not pleased to hear this confirmation of what I suspected, but at the same time, I'm also relieved to know that my suspicions were well founded, you see, for years and years. So that this thing that disturbed you at the very beginning, uh, preceding the word eclipse, you see, you could not rest until you had that word, and that word provided you a principle that allowed you to discover what it was that overshadowed the truth. you see. And I also was disturbed as an outsider like yourself, coming into Islam, coming into the Muslim community, the Muslim Ummah as an outsider, not being a born Muslim, but as you will, but as an outsider. And there's an advantage to that, because if you're an outsider, you can take a bit more of an objective view. And when we both began to take this objective perspective, we're told, hey, you're not allowed to do that. No, you have to attend the Islamic science conferences and keep your reason to yourself. You see, and this was a fascinating form of madness that I encountered, and I'm sure you encountered it as well. And our brothers and sisters at these upper levels of the academic world in Islam, surely they know these things are going on. Surely they are keeping quiet because they have subjected themselves to the taboo, which means that when judgment comes, they're not excused. They will not be excused from whatever judgment comes as a result of this act of silence, you see, this act of cowardice, you see, because that's what it is. It's an act of cowardice. Oh, I can't say that. I'll lose my job. I'll lose my position. I'll lose my social standing. I'll lose my pension. I'll lose the favor of the Sultan. I'll lose the favor of the king. I'll lose the favor of the banker who's deceptively practicing riba by calling the same facilities by another name that sounds more Islamic. I have this from the horse's mouth, from the financial director of the OIC in the Middle East years ago. He came for a conference. I rode to him in a taxi to the airport. We had a nice long discussion. And I asked him, I said, sir, is there any such thing as Islamic banking? And he said, of course not. And I said, then why are you teaching it to so? He said, I have a family to feed. So this hypocrisy will not go unanswered by heaven. And that's not a prophetic statement. That's just a statement of truth. That's what happens. Baghdad has been revisited by the same error, the same sin. You see, the same arrogance that gave Muslims the right to overwrite and override the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which the Quran says is, as you said, there's no, there's no error, there's no conflict, there's no abrogation to be found, because there's no competitive statements. If they appear to contradict one another, it's only because you, dear fellow or dear sister, have not used this with God's guidance, you see, to help you to see what they really mean. And I'm afraid that's what's happened. And many Muslims are still under that magic spell. It's the same magic spell that allows the Pope to be presented as infallible. And as I said last week, the Fatimid Caliph was also presented as infallible. You see, so there's no difference here. And the Iranians are experiencing this same problem, with their positions in their country, as open to scientific endeavor as they are. And I appreciate the Iranians. I've met several Iranians in Kuala Lumpur, and I really found them very well informed. But theologically, they're retarded. And I say that. I say that with a degree of intelligence, because the Fitra is repressed by theological misrepresentations. That's what happens. You can't avoid that. So it doesn't matter how left brained you are and how much you dull the right brain with various types of intoxicants, you'll see. And I met several of the Iranians. They were drunken Sufis, if you will. So, and very happy, very gay individuals to spend time with, very informative, lots of joy and laughter and all those good emotional experiences. But, celebrating Karbala by scourging yourself like a good Jesuit, that disturbed me. And it still disturbs me that people accept this as some sort of sound, pious activity that's going to provide them guidance. No, 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 no. And it's the same thing for those amongst the Sunni who want to stand up and chop off heads and fingers and stone women to death, buried up to their necks because they perceive or think that perhaps they've committed adultery or maybe even considered it. You see? No, 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 no. You're wrong. Both sides of the divide are wrong, seriously wrong. And I want to thank you once again, dear brother, for helping us to realize the depth of this error. It cannot be stated enough, it cannot be elucidated enough, in my view. I know we've talked about this before, but there are most likely students who tune in and people who tune in and they haven't heard those other lectures. And every time you hear it again, it goes deeper and deeper and deeper to work through the grace of God in your heart, to bring conviction and certainty that you no longer want to walk in those errors, those same errors, you see. And for that reason alone, I stopped praying behind these people because they're persisting in those errors. And I cannot stand with them shoulder to shoulder. I just cannot. And so, with that having been said, brother, unless you want to add something, um, I think we can bring it to an end here. And inshallah, we'll meet again next week.
Yeah, inshallah. I don't think I have anything to add this time. You said it very well, Brother Omar. And yeah, let's hope that the message that you or we are trying to convey here is getting through to the people and it gives them pause to reflect, which is, after all, what Allah Ta'ala Himself is asking us to do, among other things, in His book, the Quran. So thank you once again for the opportunity to share some thoughts here with you
You're
and your
most
view.
welcome. You're most welcome, brother. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.